GB News political editor Chris Hope has spoken to the Prime Minister earlier, so let's have a listen to what he had to say.
Prime Minister, the overwhelming majority of GB News viewers tell us they think they're worse off from the budget. What's your message to them now they feel you've ruined their Christmas?
Well, we have asked everybody to make a contribution to the necessary decisions and the fair decisions for our country. But what I can say to your viewers is that money is going to protect our NHS, which will be a huge concern of theirs, to make sure that when they and their families need it, I hope they don't over Christmas, but when they do, that it is protected for them. It's going into our schools to make sure every child can go as far as their talent will take them on. I know for your viewers that'll be really important. But also it's going into the measures that we're taking to drive down the cost of living. We've frozen rail fares, frozen prescription charges, and now, yesterday we announced £150 on average off all energy bills right across the country. For many of your viewers, that'll be welcome news because it's one of the bills they worry most about. If they're amongst the 6 million of the poorest families, that's on top of the 150 that we've already taken off. So they're the principles behind the decisions that we took.
But Prime Minister, you're raising taxes and giving the money from working people to those on benefits. How can that be right?
No, it's going to our NHS, it's going to our schools, and it's going on cost of living measures. But I won't apologise for the fact we are also lifting 500,000 children out of poverty. I don't want to live in a country where children pay the price in poverty, and 3/4 of the families in which children are living in poverty are working families. They're the working poor. The other thing I'd say, because we were in a hospital yesterday, is if you go to the NHS and ask them, they will say there's a direct link between child poverty and children coming into hospital. So we take the pressure off the NHS. So I'm not going to apologise for taking children out of poverty. It's desperately needed.
Prime Minister, if I can draw you on the migration figures out this morning, the figures show that numbers in asylum hotels up 13%. When are you going to get a grip on the soaring cost of illegal migration? And while I've got you, on net migration, the figure's down to 204,000 for the 12 months to June 2025. But the OBR tell us that figure will go up again to 340,000 by the end of the decade. Why can't you control legal net migration?
Well, just let me tell net migration first, because under the last government we saw the Boris wave. He promised that immigration would come down, and it quadrupled to nearly 1 million. That was unprecedented. From that very high figure, it's now down to 200,000 or so, and that is a step in the right direction. Huge measures that we've taken to that end. On the question of asylum hotels, I want to close those hotels as quickly as possible. The last government didn't process tens of thousands of claims. They therefore put people into hotels, 400 hotels at the height under the last government, now down to about 200. But your challenge to me is the right one, which is that we need to get that number down. I'm determined to close all of our asylum hotels.
Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, thank you for joining us today in a busy community centre here in Rugby. Thank you.
Your personal data could be exposed right now without you even knowing it. And if you want it removed, use incogni.com/GB News in the description now and get 60% off an annual plan on us. Incogni reach out to the data brokers on your behalf and request that your information be deleted from their databases. And they'll keep sending removal requests to make sure your data stays gone. Sometimes your information ends up on strange, obscure websites that automated tools just can't reach. And that's why Incogni just launched their unlimited plan with a feature called Custom Removals. With this, you can submit any link where your personal information appears, literally paste in the URL, and their privacy team will investigate and work to get it removed. And getting started is super easy. Hit the link in the description, create an Incogni account, and tell them whose data you want removed. Grant them permission to work on your behalf, and then all you've got to do is sit back and relax. They'll keep you updated along the way. Incogni is totally risk-free for 30 days. If you try it, it's not for you, you'll get a full refund. So take back control of your personal data today with Incogni. Use our code GBNews at checkout via the link in the description, and you'll get 60% off an annual plan.
Well, shall we speak to someone who's thought in depth about all of this, the columnist and author Lord Daniel Finkelstein. Lord Finkelstein, thanks indeed for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me on.
Just let's reflect first of all on what the Prime Minister was saying. It's almost strange. He sort of feels comfortable talking about defending the big spending choices that he's making. It's a very different Prime Minister to the one who was elected 15 months ago.
Yeah, look, I always joked that their manifesto at the election was Britain's completely broken, let's do nothing about it. They didn't really know what they wanted to do once they got elected. And, you know, in 2010, the Conservative Party went into the general election saying, you know, we're going to do things like freeze public sector pay. And they paid a price for that. I think it was one of the reasons why they fell short of getting an overall majority. But it meant in 2015, people rewarded them by saying, well, look, you did roughly do what you said you were going to do. We're on a track now, we can understand. And I think people are, you know, justifiably reasonably annoyed that, and reasonably annoyed that the government said it wouldn't increase taxes on working people and has decided to do that. But it didn't have a mandate to reduce spending or to increase borrowing either. So it had to do one of those things.
Daniel, I mean, the question I have had constantly in my head now for 24 hours is, how can any of us ever trust anything this government ever says again?
Well, I do think that's a reasonable question to put to them. I do think that. And I'm resistant to it. So, you know, I don't think we've got any alternative but to having politicians and politics, because the alternative is a terrible way of governing. So I'm very defensive normally of politicians and the dilemmas that they have. I do think fighting a general election and winning a landslide majority, saying you weren't going to increase taxes on working people, and then resisting, by the way, as you'll remember, Rishi Sunak saying that they were going to have to increase taxes. They called Rishi Sunak a liar. And all along, it was always likely that they would have to reach for this once they got about 2 years in to the government. And although Keir Starmer's now making a fist of how he intended to do this, in reality, they've been forced to it by two things. The first is the bond markets will not allow them to borrow more money. And the second is that the Labour Party will not allow the government to reform the welfare system. Now, they've therefore got no choice, really. Once you've taken those two things out of the picture, you have to increase taxes. They've increased taxes in a way that falls just short of an explicit breach of the promise on rates of income tax, VAT and NICs. But it does break their manifesto promise not to increase tax on working people, which was just as explicit.
Now, a lot of us argued at the time of the general election that the Prime Minister had form on this, the now Prime Minister had form on this. I mean, when he stood to be elected as leader of the Labour Party, he lied. He blatantly lied to this selectorate of the Labour Party, saying that he would back mass nationalisations, huge taxes, free tuition fees, all of this stuff, and ditched all of those promises as soon as he got into power. Now, given that he had form on lying to the selectorate to become Labour leader, I certainly thought it wasn't unreasonable to suggest, well, he could be doing exactly the same swindle to the general electorate at the time of the last election. A lot of people said, no, look, this is the real Keir Starmer. He's a moderate guy. Sure, he lied to the left to get in, but now this is the real Keir Starmer. I mean, they were all wrong, weren't they?
Well, yes, they were. And I did try making that argument myself before the election. It's important to note that he hasn't actually gone back to the position of his leadership election either. So he's let down those people too. His position somewhere between the position he offered the general electorate and the position he offered the Labour Party. He has not returned to the full-out policy of nationalisation. And I notice on tuition fees, for example, the situation for students has got worse rather than better. So he hasn't even satisfied, I think, the kind of left aspirations behind this electorate in the Labour Party. But the thing that we all have to reflect on is how during the general election campaign we were all so focused, for understandable reasons, on the deficiencies of the Conservative Party that we didn't then focus ourselves enough on the fact that the Labour Party was advancing a policy that would inevitably mean they'd have to break one aspect of it, either the kind of thrust of their promises to revive public services and increase welfare spending, on the other, or they would have to increase taxation, and they've obviously tried one and now flopped towards the other. I don't think it's a genuine conversion of conviction, by the way. I think both of these are sort of what happens to suit the next 5 minutes.
Daniel, isn't the fact that they've got such a huge majority going to be the reason for their downfall? Because it's the backbenchers that have prevented them from making the changes that evidently Reeves and Starmer wanted to do. They can't do them, so they've flip-flopped and sort of told half-truths. So the fact that they've got a huge majority is going to bring these two down.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the things I think is that their majority is very wide, but it's not very deep. And that means that almost every MP is sitting on a marginal constituency, and that obviously puts certain pressures onto the party. But if you elect a Labour government, Labour's going to get in. That's what's going to happen. The really, really interesting thing now is whether this politics, which is now, as you noted, I think quite acutely, moved back to this debate between tax and spend and, tax less and spend less. Is that a framing that, how does that framing affect the battle on the right between Reform and the Conservative Party? Certainly, I thought yesterday in the Commons, Kemi Badenoch appeared much more comfortable. And, speaking as someone who wants a smaller state and who wants welfare reform, I was more comfortable having her reply to the budget than I would have been, say, Nigel Farage, for all of his other kind of quite good skills at communicating, which he definitely does have. And I wonder whether it will change the terms of trade as we change the issues from from the frontline issue always being immigration to the frontline issue now being tax and spend.
It almost seems like we've got a very traditional sort of three-way split now in politics. The Labour Party is trying to own public services. The Conservative Party is trying to own low tax and sensible management of the economy. And the Reform Party owns migration. And depending on which issue is at the sort of top of voters' minds, each party might rise and fall.
Salience is very important. But, look, the Conservative Party, and I'm sure some of your viewers will be thinking this, the Conservative Party obviously, had a spotty record on tax, partly because during that last government we had COVID and, we've also spent a long time recovering from the bank collapse. So it's not been possible to drive down tax rates in the way that I think I know, because I spoke to him a fair deal about it. I know that Rishi Sunak thought was right. I think another interesting question raised by this budget is what it will ultimately mean for the government's policy on Europe. The government has made a decision effectively to endorse the European social model. It's introduced the Employment Rights Act, and it's introduced this tax and spend budget. Now we've got a situation where we're inside the European social model, but outside the economic institutions of the EU, not a policy that's really very coherent. And I've always wondered whether, as we got towards the back end of Keir Starmer's government or of a Labour government, they won't begin to think, I wonder whether we shouldn't revisit Brexit. Because my view is that the only economic policy that made sense if you were leaving the European Union was a low tax, low non-wage labour cost
I think
economy.
that makes a lot of sense. And I think if people on all sides of the argument accept this, I mean, what's the point in leaving the European Union if you're not then going to use your Brexit freedoms to make your economy more competitive? If you're going to make your economy less competitive outside of the EU, you've whacked yourself twice. Lord Finkelstein, thanks so much for joining us. I think that's a really fascinating question that we will return to as this Parliament goes on.
Yeah, OK.